So today we have a wonderful panel for the launch of a new report, Fueling Failure, How Coal, Oil and Gas Sabotage All 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We have organized this event in partnership with the Stanley Center for Peace and Security and the Nordic Council. Tomorrow marks the start of the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, where the world's environment ministers will meet to commemorate 50 years since the first UN International Summit on the Environment, which led to the Sustainable Development Agenda. In those 50 years, there have been significant moments of international cooperation to manage threats to our planet, from a nuclear ban treaty to global cooperation to save the ozone, to earlier in May when the UN decided to create the world's first global plastics treaty. Yet, in those 50 years, governments have failed to address the top threat to our climate and biodiversity, fossil fuels, responsible for 86% of the carbon dioxide emissions that have caused climate change over the past decades. Today, we are publishing a new report that finds oil, gas, and coal production and emissions are a prime threat to our water, health, biodiversity, and ability to provide food, energy, and economic security. Fueling Failure is the first report to highlight the dangers fossil fuels pose to every single UN Sustainable Development Goal. The report calls for an international framework with binding commitments that constrain fossil fuel production globally, one that complements existing pledges to cut emissions, reverse biodiversity loss, and curtails pollution, which the world fails to meet due to their rampant fossil fuel production. The question is, could Stockholm Plus 50 be a transition point on our climate trajectory? The latest iteration of the chair's summary for the conference acknowledges the threat that fossil fuels pose to humanity and the need for a solution like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, an initiative that works towards the adoption of a new international mechanism that defines a plan for a fair fossil fuel phase out. The Fueling Failure report was produced by researchers at the University of Sussex on behalf of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and key civil society partners with expertise across the Sustainable Development Goals, and many of whom are with us today. So let's introduce our panel. Freddie Daley is currently working as a researcher at the University of Sussex. His academic work focuses on sustainable behavior change, supply-side mitigation policy, climate justice, and energy transitions. For the initiative, he works as a research coordinator, managing an international team of researchers for the supply-side policy tracker project. Welcome, Freddie. We have Teresa Anderson, who is the global lead on climate justice at ActionAid International. She leads ActionAid's climate policy work on land, food, and agriculture, and coordinates Climate Action Network's working group on agriculture. Welcome, Teresa. We have Andrew Sims, who is an author, analyst, and co-director of the New Weather Institute. He's a research associate with the Center for Global Political Economy at the University of Sussex and fellow at the New Economics Foundation. Welcome, Andrew. And we have Svetlana Romanko, who is the founder of and campaign lead at Stand With Ukraine. She has been an environmental lawyer for over 20 years and has also worked for 350.org and campaigned for a just green recovery and Green Deal in Eastern Europe. Welcome, Svetlana. And last but not the least, we have Lidy Nacpil, who is the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development and a veteran civil society advocate for human rights and climate justice. She's an activist working on economic, environment, social, and gender justice issues in national, regional, and global campaigns. Welcome, Lidy. And so that's a great panel we have. And we will start with the co-author of the report, Freddie. Over to you, Freddie. Freddie will be making a presentation.
Thank you, Haji. I hope you can all see my slides okay. As you said, I'm a co-author of this report. My name is Freddie Daley. I wrote this in collaboration with Charlie Laurie, who is also based at the University of Sussex. I'm going to quickly go through our approach with this report, the argument we developed, and what we hope it will kickstart and how we hope it will move the conversation forward around fossil fuels and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to start by thanking all of our partner organisations for this report. We have 18 partners who provided invaluable comments, edits, evidence, suggestions, to really make the report what it is today. So thank you to them for engaging with us in the spirit of collaboration, and for helping us bring this report to the fore. So our approach, the starting point for this report was quite simple. We wanted to create a synthesis of evidence to highlight the incompatibility of continued fossil fuel use and the achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. To do this, we drew upon evidence from across various academic disciplines, everything from microbiology to macroeconomics, from public health scholarship to the latest climate science. We also drew on the amazing research work that the NGOs and industry watchdogs have done over the years on fossil fuels, sustainable development, and the threat of climate change. Many of those organisations partnered with us for this report, and also to provide the lived experience and capture some of the voices of the communities that are on the front line of both the climate crisis and on the front line of resistance efforts in the face of fossil fuel infrastructures. We brought together some case studies as well to really sort of bolster that side of it, which is sometimes lacking in reports like these. The sheer scale of evidence available out there meant that we could have written 17 of these reports, a 100-page report for each SDG. But fortunate for you guys, we only wrote one, so there's only one for you to read. And the result of this three-pronged approach is a report that makes an emphatic case that fossil fuels are a huge and daunting threat to the Sustainable Development Agenda. The report also highlights the huge disconnect between efforts to achieve the SDGs by 2030s and other agendas such as the energy policy agenda. So by 2030, governments are forecast to produce more than double the amount of coal, oil and gas that is compatible with a 1.5 degree threshold. We know what horrors await us when we go past this crucial threshold. The climate science is quite clear, and fossil fuel production is driving us there. So there's a clear need to align these disparate but interrelated agendas. We need to bridge the Sustainable Development Agenda with the climate policy agenda in order to increase ambition and progress within both. The SDGs have a target year of 2030, which is the same year in which humanity needs to have halved global emissions. The way we align these agendas is by tackling the issue of fossil fuels and dismantling the fossil fuel economy. But to do this, we of course have to expand the debate, and this is what we've tried to do with this report. We tried to expand the debate in two ways, beyond climate change as just a single problem or an issue, and towards fostering an understanding of climate change as an era, one which we are living through, and one which is being shaped by fossil fuel use. And when we talk about fossil fuels, especially in relation to the SDGs, we need to be more expansive in our analysis. Of course, we need to look at the impacts of coal, oil and gas, but we also need to look at factors such as plastics, which have been found at the top of Everest and at the bottom of the oceans. We need to look at fertilizers, which are playing a role in both driving climate change and pushing species to the brink of extinction. And we also need to look at, and this is so fundamental, is the behaviour of fossil fuel firms who undermine climate legislation, avoid tax, and pollute the public debate time and time again all around the world. And what we hope is that by expanding the definition of what's causing these interrelated and interconnected issues, we can also expand the range of solutions available to us. And that's a crucial point that we want to hit home with this report. So the argument that we develop in this report is twofold. Firstly, it's that fossil fuels are the main driver of climate change. They're responsible for 86% of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere over the past decade. And today we're already seeing how climate change and its impacts are undermining humanity's ability to achieve all 17 of the SDGs. And unfortunately, things are set to get worse, even under some of the more optimistic warming scenarios. Just last month we saw temperatures in India and Pakistan break 50 degrees Celsius. Extreme heat events like these, they disrupt education, exacerbate health issues, threaten water supplies, cause blackouts. It's clear that achieving the SDGs in conditions like these is an extremely challenging endeavour. So the accelerating climate crisis that's being fuelled by fossil fuels is what we classify in this report as the indirect impacts on the SDGs. The second line of argument looks at the direct impacts of fossil fuels, namely their infrastructures. And these vast infrastructures that support the exploration, extraction, refining, transportation, and combustion of fossil fuels have direct impacts which are disrupting both human and natural systems. From oil spills to contaminated waterways to the clearing of forests to make way for gas fields, the evidence is extensive, pervasive, and unfortunately it's still growing, this evidence base. And by taking into account both these indirect impacts and these direct impacts, we have tried to renew the focus on fossil fuels, not only as a target for campaigning, activism, direct action, but for ambitious climate policy at the local, national, and regional level. And these indirect impacts and direct impacts, they reinforce one another. So if we look at SDG 14, for instance, life underwater, we know that climate change, which is being fueled by fossil fuels, is fundamentally altering the chemistry of the oceans through ocean acidification. Extreme heat events are, bleaching corals and putting huge strain under marine ecosystems. And at the same time, the direct impacts of fossil fuel infrastructures from oil spills in the oceans, from the seismic surveys that take place before extraction begins, they're disrupting ecosystems to plastics that have been found right at the bottom of the oceans. So together, by looking at both the indirect and direct impacts, we want to really hone in on fossil fuels as a threat to sustainable development. And we think that this is quite unique in terms of this report, because there is a wealth of evidence out there around how climate change threatens the SDGs. The UN's SDG progress reports, which are released annually, they make multiple mentions of climate change, but they very rarely mention the F word, which is fossil fuels. So you have my full permission to say the F word loudly and unapologetically multiple times throughout the Stockholm Plus 50 conference. So where next? So we wanted this report to be constructive. We wanted it to be geared towards practical application across the rich diversity of areas that campaigners and policymakers are working in. But most of all, we wanted this report to acknowledge the disconnect, the current disconnect between policy agendas. As Harjeet said at the beginning, pledges to protect people and planet, from cutting emissions to reversing biodiversity loss to curtailing pollution, they're all failing to be achieved due to rampant fossil fuel production. While humanity as a whole suffers from this disconnect between agendas and these consistent policy failures, it is the most vulnerable communities in the world who have done the least to drive this crisis that are going to suffer the most. One stat from this report that really sort of brings that home to me is on sub-Saharan Africa. So sub-Saharan Africa is currently home to 1.1 billion people, and under current economic forecasting is expected to have the highest concentration of people in poverty in the coming decades, while at the same time also experiencing some of the most severe climate impacts. In 2020, sub-Saharan Africa, home to all of these people, was responsible for just 1% of emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels. Just 1%. That is, in some scientific climate models, that's a margin of error. It's absolutely unacceptable, and it's insane that we're not talking about the role of fossil fuels in this way. Bridging this disconnect, it requires acknowledging that sustainable development and the phasing out of fossil fuels are inextricably linked. We cannot achieve one without achieving the other. But if we fail to achieve one, we'll also sabotage efforts to achieve the other. And much like the SDGs, they're interlinked. And also, something we wanted to highlight in this report, which Harjeet mentioned at the beginning of this event, is that we need to look at both sides of the equation. We need to look at the demand and we need to look at the supply. The Paris Agreement, it focuses on emissions and measures to reduce emissions, but we also need a complementary international framework to look at the source of those emissions, fossil fuels, and we need policies with teeth to keep fossil fuels where they cannot harm people or planet and where they cannot sabotage sustainable development, and that is safely in the ground. An international framework, like a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, will be able to oversee these phase-outs, to be able to sequence them so they're equitable and fair. We'll be able to navigate the potential economic shocks and developmental challenges that would arise or that could arise from phasing out fossil fuels. It can help make sure that workers are protected and supported as they transition from working in coal, oil and gas into the low carbon industries of tomorrow that we need to rapidly scale up. And an international framework will also make sure that equity is baked into the process. You know, the climate crisis that is currently unfolding before our eyes can be traced back to the industrial development of just a handful of nations, a handful of wealthy nations. The US, the UK, Australia, Canada, Norway. These states have amassed vast amounts of waste through fossil fuel development, and their economies are now diverse enough that they can pivot away from fossil fuels without huge disruptions. So it's not only fair, but it's also right that these are the nations that are at the heart of this international framework, and that they are the nations that move first. The last point I want to finish on is political courage, which is slightly different, I think, because we always hear about political will, and that's something that I'm sure we will hear throughout the conference. You know, the drastic fall in the cost of renewable energies, innovations in technologies, in industry, in infrastructure, mean that, you know, we have many of the solutions to these intertwined crises that we're facing. And it is, you know, the barrier is what we are told is a lack of political will. But I think we need to go further here when we talk about fossil fuels, because we need to demand political courage. We need our political leaders, especially those in the global north, to have the courage to stand up to fossil fuel interests, to have the courage to untangle the fossil fuel economy and build a low carbon economy that would benefit so many more people than the current status quo. The courage to listen to the rising tide of voices around the world, young and old, that are demanding a habitable future, and the courage to put their hands up and say, you know, we have a duty and a responsibility to act. I'll leave it there so we can hear from our wonderful panelists. But yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Freddie, for giving a snapshot of the report, highlighting not just the crisis, but also what needs to be done and who needs to move first. Let's take a deeper dive and talk to our brilliant panelists here. And speaking of impacts, people and food, Teresa, I would like to come to you. We all know that the global food system is both a victim of and contributor to the fossil fuel climate change. Its ability to deliver healthy and balanced diets to all of humanity is tightly intertwined with fossil fuels. Can you unpack that a little bit for our audience?
Yes, thanks, Harjeet, and congratulations to the whole team that produced this excellent report. Agriculture is the sector that is most sensitive to climate change impacts. As a direct result of burning fossil fuels, you know, average global temperatures have steadily risen these last decades, as we all know. And these rising temperatures have brought late rains, droughts, floods, cyclones, rising sea levels, and, you know, generally unpredictable and haywire weather patterns with increasing frequency and severity. And it's the world's farming systems that have borne the brunt of these impacts. Instead of being able to predict and plan for planting and harvesting times, you know, farmers are losing their crops, they're losing their livelihoods, and people's access to food is being severely threatened. The world's agricultural workforce is actually made up of 1 billion people. So that's more than one person in every 8 around the world is dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods and for their whole family's well-being. Women actually account for about 50% of farmers in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So for them, farming in times of climate change is made all the more difficult by all the extra burdens that they also face, such as, you know, childcare, fetching water, skipping meals so their children can eat, and all the barriers they face, like policies that prevent them from accessing land or, you know, information or extension services or particularly decision-making processes. So really the climate crisis, the fossil-fueled climate crisis, is pushing women disproportionately deeper into hunger and poverty. Right now, there is an extremely severe drought in the Horn of Africa affecting Somaliland, Ethiopia, and Kenya. The rains haven't come for several seasons in a row now, and water systems have dried up, crops have failed, 1.5 million livestock have died. 20 million people in the region are at risk of famine. And at this moment, communities in Afghanistan, Southern Africa, Mozambique are all dealing with the droughts of floods, with the effects of droughts, floods, cyclones, all of which have devastated their food production. And we're getting warnings now that this year's low winter rainfalls in France are going to mean a severely reduced wheat harvest in Europe's biggest grain producing country. So fossil-fueled hunger is on the rise. But at the same time, agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases, second only to fossil fuels themselves, in fact. And that's because of these interconnections with fossil fuels, because nitrogen fertilizers, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers that are credited with boosting crop yields, require massive amount of fossil fuel in their production. And fossil fuels are also required to make herbicides and pesticides. And you see the deforestation, the soil degradation, the factory farming associated with the industrialized model of agriculture, which has been facilitated by fossil fuels, all compound farming's massive footprint. So that's why the IPCC's special report on land and climate has made clear that for food systems to become fit for purpose in an era of climate change, there needs to be a shift from industrialized farming systems towards systems of agroecology that recycle natural and locally available materials, to improve soil fertility and climate resilience and reduce dependency on fossil-fueled fertilizers. So the rising price of fuel, also due to the current war in Ukraine, is having also a knock-on effect on the price of nitrogen fertilizers, making them unaffordable for many farmers around the world. And given that many of the world's farmers and their soils have become dependent on these agrochemicals, this trend is likely to hit harvests and contribute to even greater hunger unless there's a widespread effort to train farmers and scale up knowledge on agroecological alternatives in order to improve soil fertility and crop yields. We could be facing a real cold turkey in soils if something isn't done soon. With climate change, however, as an urgent conversation, let's bring it back to fossil fuels in general. They're in the spotlight. But there has been a brazen attempt by fossil fuel corporations to rebrand themselves from being the problem to suddenly being the solution and the leaders of the climate crisis. And we see corporations like Shell and BP recently declaring targets of net zero by 2050. Which seems to be widely accepted as by many as an exciting and positive step towards a cooler planet. But actually, instead of cutting emissions by rapidly shifting away from fossil fuels, Shell's net zero climate target includes plans to invest $4 billion a year in fossil gas, $8 billion a year on oil and gas explorations, and just $2 or $3 billion a year in renewable energy. So the logic goes that they can still continue to expand fossil fuels, business as usual, and achieve net zero emissions if they simply offset the resulting emissions through planting forests, but on a scale that is staggeringly unrealistic and dangerous. And as ActionAid, we've calculated that Royal Dutch Shell's plans to offset 120 million tons of carbon dioxide through tree planting by 2030 would require around 12 million hectares of land, the equivalent of 3 times the land area of the Netherlands, where they were based. And that is just one corporation. The world will simply not have enough land available to meet demand for all the new forests and tree plantations implied in fossil fuel corporations' net zero targets. So it's also important to recognize that these land acquisitions will almost certainly focus entirely on the global south in communities that have done little to nothing to contribute to the climate crisis and who are already dealing with its impacts, thus compounding the injustice of fossil-fueled climate change. So fossil fuel corporations' use of net zero targets as a fig leaf to cover up their continued production are therefore likely to drive major conflicts over land, threatening land rights and farmers' livelihoods and putting food security further at risk and increasing hunger in the world's most marginalized communities. So we're at a crossroads. This cannot continue. We can't solve this crisis without addressing the root cause, as Freddie said in his presentation. We're now at the point where we have to choose between fossil fuels and food security because an overheating planet will not be able to feed humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, for explaining and linking it with fossil fuels so well. We are, as you said, and with so many examples, we are facing the climate crisis now, but we have another human-made crisis. So unprecedented Russia's invasion of Ukraine in late February dramatically worsened the outlook for already inflated global food prices. So tell us briefly what is needed to elevate that and who is responsible, what actions we need to take.
Well, as I mentioned already, you know, we've seen how price rises in gas are leading to dramatic price rises in fertilizers as well. And it's also no coincidence that Russia and the Ukraine are both major producers of fertilizers due to their access to fossil fuels, and this has had a contribution to the crisis. As ActionAid, we did recent research that showed that looked at how average global prices for food and fertilizer have been steep, but we also took that research to local level in communities in the global south and found that price rises have been far steeper at community level. We did research in 13 countries, communities quite far from the cities, and found that, you know, fertilizer prices had gone up by about an average of 80% already at that level. But in some communities, for example, in a region of Ethiopia, we saw that there had been an 196% increase in the cost of fertilizers. So that actually means a kind of a triple of the price overall. So this is going to have a devastating consequence because farmers cannot access or afford the fertilizers that they've become so dependent on. So that's why I'll really repeat the emphasis on shifting to agroecology as the solution, and the need to train farmers to have alternatives to improve their soil fertility and crop production.
Thank you, Teresa. Lidy, I would like to come to you. I know you have to leave for another event at the People's Forum. Let's go back to fossil fuel firms. We know how you know, despite all their promises and pledges, these fossil fuel firms are not driving the energy transition. In fact, they are subverting it. So how should civil society focus their efforts? So share your experience.
Well, you know, it's really been inspiring in the last decade how there have been so many movements across the world that have risen up and, you know, stood up to the challenge of ending fossil fuels. We have many campaigns across Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Pacific, of course, in Europe and North America, that have been directly challenging first governments and public financial institutions for driving the expansion of the industry, for delaying the phase out of the industry by, you know, mobilizing trillions of dollars to support the industry through public subsidies, incentives, and at scale that is 20 times more than whatever they have been delivering in terms of climate finance. So you can see the the tragedy, the irony, the outrageous injustice of that they are so much more willing to mobilize public finance to support fossil fuels and have been, you know, just refusing to face up to their obligations to provide climate finance, not just for the energy transition, because the energy transition in the South cannot happen without climate finance, cannot succeed fully, but also to cover the loss and damage and the need for adaptation because of the climate impacts that these governments of rich countries, corporations, public financial institutions have been primarily responsible for. And then, of course, directly challenging corporations because the governments are too slow in reining in not just fossil fuel corporations, but banks, right? Investment houses, financial intermediaries, there's insurance corporations, there's a whole host of private corporations and institutions who are so much complicit, not just the fossil fuel corporations, but a whole host range of actors in the private sector that are so much more complicit in this. And I just like to add, before I rush off, to congratulate Freddie and Charlie for such an excellent and comprehensive report. We're looking forward to expanding on the different topics. As Freddie said, it can cover so many more reports. And just maybe like to add an area where we need to investigate more, and we will help in that. And that is how the fossil fuel industry have contributed a lot to the huge debt problem of countries in the South are staggering with in the face of this multiple crisis. you know, lending has fueled the expansion of the industry, the development of the industry, public as well as private lending. And in the general call for cancellation of debts, we are also saying that an immediate cancellation is needed for all the debts arising out of fossil fuel projects. These are illegitimate debts. There's already an acknowledgement of the harm that these fossil fuel projects have created, and they cannot do any less but to cancel the debts that have arisen out of this. And I say this especially with the upcoming G7 summit at the end of this month, where many movements will come together both to call for a phase out of fossil fuels and an immediate cancellation of the debts of the South. Thank you so much. And we hope that everyone will really actively disseminate the report. Use this. Our campaigns will definitely benefit from this report, and we will be using not just the data, the analysis, but also the recommendations. And just one more, we really support the call for this approach. We need fairness and justice. We need speed, and that needs to be a global effort. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lidy, for being with us. As you rightly said, fossil fuels have caused havoc in so many spheres, and they've also fueled wars. And I would like to go to Svetlana. Earlier this year, hundreds of organizations led by Ukrainian people made a collective call on world's governments to reject and ban the importation of Russian oil and gas. Furthermore, you all urged the world to not simply replace Russian-produced fossil fuels with the ones from other countries. How could and why should a fossil fuel treaty play a role in ending that addiction? Svetlana, please share your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Harjit, and everyone. I am happy to be here with you, and I am happy to cause a SDG report, goal number 16, which encourages us to reflect on the peace and human rights and wars and conflicts. I have to say from the very beginning that I think that's a very milestone report and important for where we are now, because we are far behind the SDG goals achievement, which has been planned as an agenda by 2030. But as we see an example of the war in Ukraine and other fossil fuel conflict around the world, and the carbon bombs, which Russia only has 41 of them. So we are still far behind of achieving of those goals. And the report answers in the way of how we can hasten the achievement of meeting three main criteria of CDG goals globally, but also in some regions and in some locations as Ukraine. First of all, I would like to stress that Ukrainian civil society being clear-eyed not only on those interconnections between the war and fossil fuels and energy insecurity and climate crisis that all share the same roots, and these roots are fossil fuels, but also on the necessity to endorse the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, because at the beginning of April, we, as Ukrainian Climate Network, launched a call which stated that we must implement the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to stop fossil fuel addiction behind Putin's war machine. For the past months, we have seen our homeland transformed into a front lines for an atrocious imperialistic war fueled by Russian oil, gas, and coal. And as Russia's war in Ukraine enters its fourth month, it's definitely clear fossil fuels are a weapon of mass destruction. And one of both, this war and the ongoing climate crisis are rooted. The three pillars of the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty will provide us with hope and the vision for socially responsible, equitable, and green post-war recovery of Ukraine. We see now how much destruction has already been done to Ukraine by this fossil-fueled war. We would need to rebuild all that has been damaged, but we don't want to do it in the old way. Post-war reconstruction of Ukraine should follow the path of green and secure recovery, with all financial resources applied to eliminate dependence on fossil fuels and boost energy efficiency and deliver accelerated clean energy transition. And in general, climate change, same as nuclear weapons, is a major global threat. This is not the time to simply displace Russian coal, oil, and gas with those from other countries, and definitely not the time to increase production of fossil fuels. This is a moment to create a path to global security through energy and climate security. By stopping the expansion of oil, gas, and coal, phasing out fossil fuels, and jumpstarting a just transition powered by viable and accessible clean energy, we create a better future for all. And actually, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is a framework that encourages us to think and to join in three main strategic ways, strategic dimensions. The first is ending and stopping all new exploration of fossil fuels. And here I would like again to refer to carbon bombs, because the war in Ukraine is the latest horrific fossil fueled war, but it's not the first one, but hopefully we have all chances it will be the last one. If we phase out fossil fuels, that's the second pillar of fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And the third, that's very important, which I already stated, is to provide a fast and just and fair transition to a clean energy and boost clean energy investments everywhere. That's the way how we can meet the CDG goal number 16. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana, and being very concrete in connecting how the fossil fuel treaty can really help achieve some of these goals, and how there's a massive gap in the global system right now in terms of lack of a framework. Andrew, I would like to come to you. We are living in a situation where there's another fossil fuel price crisis. And how do we debunk doubts that the ability to shift rapidly to much less economically and ecologically painfully energy systems? People keep raising questions about it. So tell us more.
Thanks, Haji. And also,
can you unmute yourself, Andrew?
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. Thank you, Haji. And real solidarity goes out to Svetlana as well. And really interesting to hear from Lidy and Teresa and Freddie, and a sense of some sort of deja vu when Lidy was talking about the debt crisis too, thinking back to how the debt crisis itself had its roots in an earlier pushing of fossil fuel dollars that were washing around in northern banks onto the global south. And listening to everybody speak, you kind of asked the question how to encapsulate this problem. Well, 13 years ago in Copenhagen, when rich nations first pledged 100 billion in climate finance, which is, as we know, a paltry sum in comparison to the challenges, and still that pledge hasn't been delivered. And yet, more than that is spent every week on fossil fuel subsidies. So I'm really here today with my hat on as the Rapid Transition Alliance, which is the supporter of the treaty, which we set up in 2018 because we thought there was a lack of evidence-based hope of the possibility of change at the speed and scale that the science said was needed. Throwaway line, but people said it was easier to visualize the end of the world than a change to our debt and fossil-fueled economic system. But we wanted to change that. So we brought together countless examples across different time zones, from history, different places around the world and different sectors on the possibilities to align rapid low carbon transition with progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can find a lot more of those on the Rapid Transition website, which is rapidtransition.org. And we built a community of organizations to share and amplify those. But we also understood that new measures and mechanisms were needed to move on and leave the old polluting world behind. And that's why with my colleague, Professor Peter Newell, and I, we suggested the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty back in 2018. And because we'd been looking at precedents for change, and that year was the 50th anniversary of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which itself was negotiated in just 3 years at the height of the Cold War. That's been replaced by the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that was signed in 2017 and entered into force in 2021. So an example of how, even in very difficult circumstances, treaties can be achieved. And because until we let go of fossil fuels, they're going to continue to distract from urgent and possible transitions. And they will take not just money and time, but energy and the political space that we need to move on. Global heating, we've heard very clearly, and fossil fuel and the fossil fuel resource curse are the enemy of the SDGs because they're polluting, centralizing, corrupting, economically extractive, destabilizing. And as we heard from Svetlana, they drive divisive and create systems and create conflict. And they're in the way of something better. And what's slightly depressing is that when the SDGs were still the Millennium Development Goals, we looked at this with the Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies and the New Economics Foundation way back then, and saw how even then we could see, and this is many years ago, how climate change was going to undermine all the MDGs. And we've heard also the immediate impacts on of the extreme weather events happening in India and Pakistan. But the good news is that we know rapid transitions are possible and that climate justice is achievable. We know from the work that's been done, for example, by Mark Jacobson at Stanford University, who's modeled 139 countries and how they could obtain 100% of their energy from wind, water, and solar. And as far as I know, nobody has yet been invaded for a wind farm or a solar farm. We know that even in the most energy intensive countries like the US, they could transition to a clean energy grid at 80% by 2035. Possibly even sooner than that, 2030. And back in the teeth of the financial crisis, another great upheaval 10 years ago, we first suggested a Green New Deal. And as a response to climate and economic crisis, similar proposals have now been developed which show how such plans could be implemented. In the Global South, decentralized multi-technology renewables are quick. They create access to energy to rural populations quicker and more cheaply than fossil fuel powered grid extension. They create more jobs. They spread economic benefits more equally and empower communities. So kind of what's not to like. And in the global north, we're seeing dramatic drops in the cost and rapid uptake of renewables. New global capacity for generating electricity from solar, wind, and other renewables increased to a record level last year and is set to grow further this year, bringing benefits for energy security and climate benefits. And they've been beating fossil fuels in terms of adding new capacity for years. New additions expected to be 320 gigawatts. That's close to meeting the entire electricity demand of Germany or matching the European Union's total electricity generation from natural gas, one of the ways we can quickly get off Russian gas. Now, the new speed of action that only recently seemed impossible is reminding us of what we can do. And even I come from the UK, and in the UK, we forget how quickly we've done things in the past. In the UK, we switched from outdoor plumbing, having toilets outdoors, to indoor plumbing in the space of about 2 decades, not only 2 generations ago. Another forgotten episode, in just 8 years, the UK switched one of its energy supplies from old, more polluting town gas to natural gas. Now, obviously, we need to move on from that, but we did that in the space of 8 years. We switched 17 million households in the space of 8 years. You look at countries that have been heavily dependent on gas, like the Netherlands and Finland. As of in 2018, gas heated 9 out of every 10 homes in the Netherlands. But now the Netherlands is planning to abandon its gas grid and use this transformative shift to drive the decarbonization of its wider built environment. In 1970, 90% of Finland's heating was done by burning timber and oil. Now that oil dependency has dropped to just 11% of the fuel that it uses. Yesterday, we had a discussion in the People's Forum about examples of the shift to car-free cities. If we can crack our car dependence, which is one of the main sources of immediate pollution, which affects people's health from the burning of fossil fuels, that will give us progress, which we had example after example of cities that are moving fast on that. This afternoon at the forum, we're going to be talking about ending fossil ads, that tool for the normalization of the fossil fuel industries. And it's important to remember that fuel poverty is also increasingly a fact of life for people in countries like the UK and other, we call them advanced industrialized countries, but they are also often very unequal, and that rapid just transition offers not just a way to insulate homes from cold and heat, but also from volatile energy prices and from unemployment and from extreme weather. And they're a way to reverse inequality. So just to sort of wrap up on that big question, the environment, quality of life, physical well-being, current and future prospects are all held hostage to oil, coal and gas interests. And the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty gives us a way to break those chains of dependence. And going back to what Freddie said right at the start of this session, it's time to replace the old discourse of timidity and delay with a discourse of doing something, a discourse of courage and accelerated change. These are not just technical issues, but they're issues of finding the courage to act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and also connecting that with how Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty can actually provide a roadmap to achieve that. So it's not that we don't know the solutions. We know what needs to be done, and we know we very well can. And there are examples in the past that are very inspiring. But we need the political will to make that happen. We need resources to be put, where the mouth is, where the need is, and that's what has not been happening. So how Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty can actually enable that kind of international cooperation and solidarity that is needed to make that happen. Freddie, you have been listening to everybody, and we have been reading the report, and you heard from the panelists speaking very high of the analysis that you have done. So I would like to come to you to ask, seeing now it's very clear that fossil fuels are a singular threat that undermines our efforts within the Sustainable Development Agenda. It's a sobering taste of our climate reality that we are facing, and we heard many examples from Teresa and others. So what's the key takeaway you would want everyone to leave with, knowing what the challenge is and what the solutions are? So.
Well, it's a great question, and I think the key takeaway points, and this is something that I discussed with with co-author Charlie and I. We've sort of wrapped our brains around this, and I think we believe that the key takeaway from this report is around speed and scale. So maybe that's 2 points, but forgive me if you will. Achieving all 17 of the SDGs by 2030, it's already a tall order. But when you factor in, the urgency and necessity of bending the global emissions curve, as well as all the climate impacts that are already guaranteed, that are already baked in, you really get a sense of what needs to happen. It's less than 8 years away. 8. That's a couple of government elections in some states. In others, it's less than 2 terms of government. It's just over 1 investment cycle. So if we're serious about doing this, about revitalizing the Sustainable Development Agenda, ramping up climate ambition, saving lives, we need to see international collaboration on a scale not seen before. We need to see the level of finance flowing from north to south for renewables, for technology, for aid, adaptation, reparations for loss and damage, debt cancellation. All of this must increase exponentially. And as Teresa touched on, we need to see courage, leadership, and integrity, not just pledges and promises which are built on sand and far enough into the future to not just disrupt the status quo today. We need to see immediate action and immediate cuts to both production and emissions. And that emphasizes the scale, but speed is everything here too. Speed is absolutely everything when you talk about the Sustainable Development Agenda. Speed, because the speed at which we act is lives and livelihoods saved. People living today, but also people that are yet to be born. And in many ways, speed is climate justice. So speed and scale, that's what we need to see. Thank you, Harjeet.
Thank you, Freddie. So yeah, very, very clearly what needs to be done, and definitely the speed is much more important, as scientists have been warning us that we have very few years left to bend the curve. And as we face, series of climate impacts and absolutely unprecedented, we just have no time to waste. And we know that when we talk about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, that has now become a global movement, and civil society is playing a very important role. We are seeing how parliamentarians are joining the campaign. We are seeing how hundreds of thousands of individuals have endorsed it. We have more than 50 cities and local governments who are now calling on their governments to act. And there is a growing momentum. And civil society has played a very important role to put a spotlight on the gap, and we still have to do a lot. So I would like to bring Teresa back again to talk about how civil society can play a role in pushing it forward, and how we elevate the demands of the Global South in meeting the SDGs.
Thanks, Harjeet. Yeah, civil society really has a very important role to play, as we know that it has been civil society's voice that has consistently been pushing government, national and international governments to take climate action. And it's particularly, the communities in the global south who are increasingly recognized as having a critical voice for rationale for the need for urgent climate action, because it's communities who are both on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction who are harmed most. For example, upcoming plans in East Africa for the East Africa crude oil pipeline is going to displace possibly 100,000 people, and so communities in East Africa are starting to mobilize, and the rest of the world needs to elevate those voices, but also the communities who all over the world who are suffering the impacts of rising temperatures and climate impacts really must be supported. And the SDGs really play a valuable tool for civil society and communities to point to for really, clanging that death knell of fossil fuels, because we all know that the time of fossil fuels has to end, and it will end if humanity is to continue, civilization is to continue. But the speed matters so that we have the choice in how to shape that change, because it's really important that civil society, that local communities in Global South and North are participating actively in the shaping of the just transition away from fossil fuels to the better alternatives. We know, of course, that communities are concerned about what the impact of losing fossil fuel livelihoods will be, as well as potential loss in what they promised will be energy access, energy resources, and so it's urgent and necessary that there's finance, that there's planning processes and inclusive planning processes that enable communities to really articulate and shape what that vision for a just transition should be. Because we know that if communities are involved in shaping of that alternative, then they can become the loudest champions for that shift. And it's urgent that their voices are involved and that the future addresses current inequalities rather than exacerbating them. So just transitions are absolutely essential to the SDGs, and civil society will be civil society's momentum that takes us finally to that place.
Absolutely. Teresa, we have seen governments have been failing us. We have been very well aware of this crisis and all the human-made crisis that we have seen over the last few decades. It's civil society that holds that baton and actually can shake the world's conscience that what needs to be done, and putting people at the heart of those solutions and the movement. We did request our participants to put questions in the chat, and if we haven't seen any, I would like to open it very quickly. If anybody would like to ask a question, raise your hand. We can take one or two questions before we close. Okay, if not, I'll come to Svetlana for a closing comment, and then to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. And these days and these months that we are in multiple crises showed the slow and overall weak global response to Russian aggression, and also some concrete steps on the inevitable phasing out of Russian fossil fuels have been taken or promised to be taken in the near future. Their speed and comprehensiveness leave much to be desired, and the fueling of the war in Ukraine and other fossil fuel conflicts in the world, around the world, as it was mentioned by Teresa, ECOP, and also Vaca Muerta, and also some conflicts in Asia, in the Philippines, and in many other countries, and Guyana offshore, and many others that we know. They all are the same picture of aggression of fossil fuels against the civil society and against us, the humanity, everywhere. So this must stop. And of course, many governments have pledged to cut their dependence on Russian fossil fuels, or just made some net zero pledges in the near term, but these measures will not have have an immediate impact on Russia's ability to wage a war. And it's harder for Europe to follow suit, given that it depends on Russian fossil fuels for 40% of its energy needs. And we are looking at Europe right now, we are encouraging European Union to take bolder action and lead the green, clean energy transition globally, as they committed to do with the European Green Deal. And as I see a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty movement rising up and supporting very much the movement for ban Russian oil and gas fossil fuels, I think that it's very important for us to acknowledge that people power comes from the bottom up. And we see many cities who endorse the treaty. We expect these cities to come up and join movement in Ukraine, even being so much in the war and destruction. We still join in the global movement and trying to call all the cities and all the states to endorse the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty and keep the fossil fuels in the ground forever. And this is the main call I have to make for today. And please join our movements, because together we are united and we can do much more than being separated. Thank you.
Absolutely, Svetlana. Thank you very much for that call. Andrew, over to you. 30 seconds, your closing thought.
Yeah, thanks so much. Just really, really quickly. I mean, it's always been said that governments lead from behind. And when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals that we've been talking about today, every one of those has originated in drives and campaigns from civil society. So we know that governments are going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming to take action. But we also know we've demonstrated our ability, our agency at rapid transition. We have all the evidence, everything we need, we already have. It now needs to be applied. And I think the evidence of seeing the passing of a treaty like the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that was a civil society movement that made it happen. So the more we reach out, the more we bind people in, the more we work together across borders on this issue, the faster we will get to our goal. Thank you.
Super. That was spot on and a very clear message to all of us, and inspiring as well of the power of civil society. Okay, that brings us to the end of this very, very interesting conversation. Thank you to all our panelists. We'll be continuing the conversation today about the global just transition from fossil fuels with our own Stockholm +50 pre-summit to advance conversations and collective actions to address fossil fuel supply at the international level. There are many ways you can also join and get involved with the treaty, so you can endorse as an organization. I'm going to put the link here. And as an individual, and you can also visit our campaign hub to look at the tools that we have created. As Svetlana said, there are many cities who are joining and many more who can join and support it. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining for this conversation. And we will be sharing the recording link on our, so do see our social media channels. Thank you very much. Take care. We'll see some of you around.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.